दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम कृपाल मां परम कृपाल, श्री मां शारदा परम कृपाल, परम कृपाल मां परम कृपाल, श्री मां शारदा परम कृपाल, करुणा सागर युग अवतार, नैया हमरी करो भव पार, करुणा सागर युग अवतार, नैया हमरी करो भव पार, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम कृपाल मां परम कृपाल, श्री मां शारदा परम कृपाल, परम कृपाल मां परम कृपाल, श्री मां शारदा परम कृपाल, करुणा सागर युग अवतार, नैया हमरी करो भव पार, करुणा सागर युग अवतार, नैया हमरी करो भव पार, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल, परम दयाल प्रभु परम दयाल, राम कृष्ण प्रभु परम दयाल। ओम श्री राम कृष्ण भगवान की जय।
शंगली काली magamaye,
शंगली काली magamaye,
शिव शंकरी देवी करुमारी,
शिव शंकरी देवी करुमारी,
शंगली 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 शंगली
शंगली शंगली शंगली शंगली
शंगली काली magamaye,
शंगली काली magamaye,
शिव शंकरी देवी करुमारी,
शिव
शंगली शंगली ओम श्री रामकृष्ण भगवान की जय। जीवन प्रभाते वर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते वर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। बोलो राम कृष्ण जपो राम कृष्ण बोलो राम कृष्ण जपो राम कृष्ण भज मन राम कृष्ण रे। भज मन राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। राम कृष्ण नाम बोले मन वीराम। राम कृष्ण नाम बोले मन वीराम। शीतल होवे सब ज्वाल रे। शीतल होवे सब ज्वाल रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। राम कृष्ण जय बोले मनिराशय। राम कृष्ण जय बोले मनिराशय। शांत होवे मन प्राण रे। शांत होवे मन प्राण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। बोलो राम कृष्ण जपो राम कृष्ण बोलो राम कृष्ण जपो राम कृष्ण भज मन राम कृष्ण रे। भज मन राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। जीवन प्रभाते मर मेरा साथे बोलो जय राम कृष्ण रे। 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 ओम श्री राम कृष्ण भगवान की માર્ગે આવો મારે મનરે ભાવો નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા તમે મારા થયા હું તમારો થયો નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા હું તો વાતલરી તારી જોતો મારા તારે વિયોગે રોતો હું તો વાતલરી તારી જોતો મારા તારે વિયોગે રોતો આંખો ભીની ભીની રોય રોય થાય છે જીની નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા તમે મારા થયા હું તમારો થયો નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા શ્યામ ભક્ત કહે પ્રભુ આવો આવી હાથ પકડજો મારો શ્યામ ભક્ત કહે પ્રભુ આવો આવી હાથ પકડજો મારો મુખે માંગુ એવું તારે ચરણે રહેવું નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા તમે મારા થયા હું તમારો થયો નંદલાલા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા આવો આવો કનૈયા તારા ઓમ શ્રી રામકૃષ્ણ ભગવાનની જય.
I think it's always wise in times of crisis to find some source of comfort in history. History is a valuable asset for two reasons. Firstly, it gives us some guide to help us face the challenges that we are currently facing. And secondly, it can sometimes remind us that things could be a lot worse than they currently are. For example, the time of the bubonic plague in Europe, a plague that killed hundreds of millions of people. And obviously during this time, almost all international transport was via ships. And of course, to prevent the spread of the disease, many countries, like today, were hesitant to let ships dock in their ports. And so the general requirement was for ships to remain in the harbor of destination countries for a period of 40 days. And the Italian word for 40 is quarata, which is where the word quarantine comes from. Quarantine has been a time of extreme challenges for many of us, but historically speaking, quarantine was also a time of extreme progress for humanity. On Christmas Day 1642, the world saw the birth of Sir Isaac Newton, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, scientific minds in all of history. At the age of 20, Newton purchased a book on astrology out of a pure curiosity to see what was in it. He read the book until he came to a diagram which he could not understand because he was ignorant of trigonometry. He then went out and bought a book on trigonometry and read it, but found that he could not follow some of the theorems because he was ignorant of geometry. So he went out again and bought another book on geometry and began to read. 3 years later, there was an outbreak of plague which forced many to remain indoors and isolated. Newton was a student at Cambridge University at the time and occupied himself by inventing differential and integral calculus, which are one of the main foundations of science and mathematics today. Through his discovery of calculus and while in quarantine, Newton made fundamental discoveries around the nature of light and laid the foundations for the theory of universal gravitation. When asked about how he accomplished such amazing discoveries, Newton simply replied by thinking about them. Now, after using so many big words, I'd like to take a step back. Many people may argue that Newton was just genetically gifted, that no one has the power to naturally alter their genes to be exactly like Newton. However, that isn't true. Recently, scientists have discovered, probably using calculus at some point, that it is possible for us to alter our genetic makeup. The field is known as epigenetics. And epigenetics states that it is possible for us to alter our genes using our environment or even our thoughts. Scientists have shown that the human mind is so powerful that it is actually capable of switching off genes which create undesirable effects. The example I will use in this case is stress. Recently, a study was conducted to understand the harmful effects of stress on the body. Participants were given 1 or 2 articles on stress to read, and they were put into some stressful situation and their bodily responses were measured. The first article was about the harmful effects of stress on the body, for example, higher blood pressure, stress headaches, heart attacks, etc. And true enough, doctors saw that when one thought about stress as harmful or scary, then the body reacted negatively. Various arteries constricted and people found it difficult to concentrate or think clearly. But when doctors gave an article stating that stress was beneficial and subjected the participants to the same stressful situation, they actually found the body's function improved. Blood circulation increased, brain function increased, people were able to think clearly and more creatively. It's as if the body was actively trying to help participants who thought stress was beneficial to get through tough situations. But of course, all of us have been through extremely stressful situations and naturally find it extremely difficult to think of stress positively when we actually need to. And therefore, spirituality becomes a necessity for us in this world, because the purpose of spirituality is the removal of suffering. And all of us are in some ways spiritual seekers, because firstly, if you were not a spiritual seeker, you would not be listening to the satsang. And secondly, we all want the removal of suffering from our lives. However, we have gone astray in thinking that pleasure is the antidote to suffering, which is not true. And the reason we know that it is not true is due to the works of revered Swami Nishrananda Maharaj, who saw the need for spirituality, specifically Vedanta, for all of South Africa, especially in the case of youth and children that grew up during and who continue to experience the effects of apartheid. So what is spirituality? Spirituality, in the broadest sense, according to Sri Krishna, is evenness of mind. That basically means that no matter what happens to us in our lives, whether we are successes or failures, whether we are rich or poor, whether we are famous or ignored, we are not affected by victory or defeat. We are not affected by pleasure or pain. And in this way, we transcend suffering. Because no matter what happens to us, we are not affected. We have this evenness of mind. But how do we achieve this? Swami Vivekananda gives the answer: control of the mind. But how do we control the mind? There are various meditation and mindfulness apps available today that will help us to train and control the mind. But I think it's very useful, aside from all of these apps and programs that you can download, to understand how the mind and the body work and the extent of control that we have over ourselves. To begin with, it's important to understand that the sense organs have a certain degree of independence. And we see this in the fact that some people just naturally prefer Coke rather than Fanta, or reading rather than movies, and so on and so forth. We all have our own individual preferences. Our body-mind complex is made up of 5 key elements: the sense organs, the brain, the mind, the intellect, and the self, or the Atman if you prefer. So first and foremost, the senses detect an object either through sight, smell, taste, touch, or sound. After the senses have picked up this object, the impulses created by that object are transported from the sensory organs, the eyes, the ears, the nose, mouth, or even the hands, to the brain. The brain then interprets these impulses. What does the object look like? What does it smell like? What does it taste like? Does it look attractive? Is it repulsive? And once the brain has formed this interpretation, which normally takes about a few milliseconds, the brain presents these findings to the mind. The mind then analyzes these findings and signals to us, the Atman, based on these findings of the senses in the brain, whether or not the object is pleasurable or painful, whether the object is desirable or undesirable. Thereafter, the conclusions of the mind are then presented to the intellect. And the role of the intellect is decision making. So the intellect has the power to reject or accept the recommendations of the mind and thereby the senses, or even completely ignore the recommendations of the mind and the senses altogether. And finally, the decision-making processes of the intellect are programmed, are set by the Atman. In other words, the Atman has control over the intellect has control over the mind has control over the brain, and the brain has control over the senses. So if we want to achieve anything in life, it is vital that we achieve this control of ourselves and not let the randomness of genetics determine our futures or our achievements in life. There's a very famous extract from a book called Range by David Epstein, which asks the question, how do we know if a plant is dead? We can't check the pulse of a plant. We can't see if a plant is still breathing or not. So how do we check if a plant has died? And the answer is, a plant is dead when it has stopped growing. And we can apply this logic to our own minds. If we have stopped learning and exposing ourselves to new and higher ideas, then even if we're still walking, talking, eating, breathing, our minds have died because we have stopped learning, we have stopped growing. I think it's also worth remembering that the greatest of the human species, be it Einstein or Steve Jobs, Newton, Swami Nishananda, Swami Vivekananda himself, did not place limitations on their learning or on their minds. They never once said, I am too old to learn this, or I'm too young to understand this subject. They were relentless in their pursuit of knowledge. And I think that in the age of Google and YouTube, we have a responsibility, we have a duty to continue to learn and grow, no matter who we are and no matter how old we are. And this is quite literally the only possible way that we and the rest of the world will continue to progress and be able to find ourselves out of any difficult situation that we are placed in. I would like to end today with a very famous quote from Swami Vivekananda. We want that education by which character is formed, strength of mind is increased, the intellect is expanded, and by which one can develop the courage to stand on one's own 2 feet. Hari Om Tat Sat.
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
राम का नाम सब कोई बोलो,
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 राम का नाम सब कोई बोलो।
राम का नाम सब कोई बोलो।
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
सबके मन में राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं, राम बसे हैं।
कृष्ण गोपाला सब कोई बोलो,
कृष्ण गोपाल सब कोई बोलो, सब कोई बोलो।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
श्री राम कृष्ण सब कोई बोलो।
श्री राम कृष्ण सब कोई बोलो।
शारदा माता सब कोई बोलो।
शारदा माता सब कोई बोलो।
विवेकानंदा सब कोई बोलो।
विवेकानंदा सब कोई बोलो।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
श्री राम कृष्ण सब कोई बोलो।
श्री राम कृष्ण सब कोई बोलो।
शारदा माता सब कोई बोलो।
शारदा माता सब कोई बोलो।
विवेकानंदा सब कोई बोलो।
विवेकानंदा सब कोई बोलो।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है।
सबके मन में राम बसे है, राम बसे है, राम बसे है। ओम श्री राम कृष्ण भगवान की जय।
Om Namo Narayanaya, dear sisters and brothers. Let us sit calmly and meditate for a few moments. O Vivekananda, you are happy, contented, and peace-loving. You are the embodiment of discrimination. You carry out your duties courageously to fulfill karma. You are the embodiment of courage and possess the qualities of Lord Shiva. O Vivekananda, eternally regarded as courageous and good, we sing your glory this auspicious morning. I bow to Vivekananda, the ever-pure one, who is the teacher supreme, the protector of the universe, the foremost amongst the monks who incarnated on earth for the redemption of humankind. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.
ॐ सर्वेषां स्वस्तिर्भवतु, सर्वेषां शान्तिर्भवतु, सर्वेषां पूर्णं भवतु, सर्वेषां मङ्गलं भवतु, सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। ॐ पूर्णमदः पूर्णमिदं पूर्णात् पूर्णमुदच्यते पूर्णस्य पूर्णमादाय पूर्णमेवावशिष्यते। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। हरि ओम तत्सत्।
जय श्री गुरु महाराज की
जय।
महामाय की
जय।
स्वामी जी महाराज की
जय।
गंगा मात की
जय।
महावीर स्वामी जी की
जय।
सर्व ऋषि मुनीन की
जय। पार्वती पतये हर हर महादेव की जय। ओम नमो नारायणाय।
Sarvadeva Devi Swarupaya Shri Ramakrishnaya Namaha. I offer my salutations to Shri Ramakrishna, who is the embodiment of all the gods and goddesses. Dear sisters, brothers, and loving children, Om Namo Narayanaya. Welcome to our Hinduism class for today. We are very happy that you are once again able to join our discussion on the life and teachings of Bhagavan Sri Ramakrishna, who is respectfully addressed as the Master. Sri Ramakrishna used everyday relevant examples to help us understand the profound truths of spirituality. The Master says, "You see many stars in the sky at night, but when the sun rises, you no longer see them. Can you say that there are no stars during the day? Certainly not. Therefore, in the days of ignorance, we should not say that there is no God. The all-compassionate Lord is always there for us. Even if we are happy or sad, we must remember that God is always with us to give us all the strength that we need." In today's lesson, we shall discuss a few interesting teachings of Sri Ramakrishna through inspiring stories that the Master narrated, and conclude with a verse from the Bhagavad Gita. There is a saying, "Don't leave for tomorrow what you can do today, and what you can do today, do now." However, many of us are in the habit of procrastinating. We need determination, perseverance, and enthusiasm to reach the goal. Sri Ramakrishna explains this through a parable. Once there was a severe drought. The farmers began to dig long channels to connect the water to their fields. One farmer was determined to bring water to his field from the river. He vowed that he would not stop digging until the channel connected his field with the river. He worked hard for hours. It was already past midday, so his wife sent their daughter to call him. "Dad," said the girl, "please come home and have your meal." "Go away," yelled the farmer. "I have much to do now." After a while, his wife came to him and said, "The food is getting cold. Please come and have your lunch. You overdo everything. You can finish the rest tomorrow or even later today." The farmer refused to listen. He scolded her furiously and shouted, "What? Don't you know? There is no rain. The crops are dying. What will the children eat? We shall all starve to death. I have vowed not to think of bath or food until I bring water to my field." The wife noticed his determination and went away quietly. Through a whole day's back-breaking labor, the farmer managed to connect his field to the river. Then he relaxed and watched the water flow into the field with a murmuring sound. His mind was filled with peace and joy. He went home and called to his wife and said, "Now, my dear, I shall have my bath and supper." Thereafter, with a serene mind, he retired to bed and snored to his heart's content. This is an example of strong determination and renunciation. Now, there was another farmer who was also digging a channel to bring water to his field. His wife, too, came to the field and said to him, "It's late now. It isn't necessary to overdo things. You had better come home." The farmer didn't protest, but put his spade aside and said, "Well, I'll go home since you asked me to." That man never succeeded in irrigating his field. This is a case of mild renunciation. As without strong determination, the farmer cannot bring water to his field, so also without intense yearning, a man cannot realize God. Sri Ramakrishna says, "We shed jugs full of tears for husband, wife, children, and home. But who cries for God? If we yearn for God, we are sure to see him." The Master narrated the following story to show us how to view religion and see God in all from a practical point of view. A holy man lived in a forest with many of his disciples. One day he taught them a beautiful lesson of seeing God in all. In this way, they learnt to have a respectful attitude towards everyone and everything. Later on, the disciples went to gather wood for the sacrificial fire. Suddenly, they heard a loud warning. "Move out of the way quickly, a mad elephant is coming." All the disciples ran and took shelter in a safe place. But one disciple thought to himself that since the Guru had taught him to see God in every being, the elephant is also God in another form. So, in that case, why should he run away from it? He stood on the road, bowed respectfully before the elephant, and even started chanting sacred hymns. The Mahout, who is the elephant's keeper, continued to shout, "Run away, run away!" But the disciple did not move an inch. The majestic elephant lifted him up with his trunk and threw him forcefully on the ground. Hurt and bruised, the disciple lay unconscious on the ground. Hearing about what had happened, the teacher and his brother disciples rushed to the spot where he was lying and carried him back to their ashram. After receiving some treatment for his injuries, he soon regained consciousness. The teacher asked him, "You saw the animal coming, and you also heard the warning. Then why didn't you run away?" The disciple replied, "Sir, you taught us to see God in every being. Therefore, I thought that the animal is also God in another form, and didn't run away." Then the teacher corrected him, saying, "Yes, my child, it is true that the elephant was God in another form, but the Mahout who was driving the elephant was also a form of God, and he instructed you to run away. Since all are manifestations of God, why didn't you trust the Mahout's words for your own safety? You should have listened to the words of the Mahout God." The Master teaches us that God dwells in all beings, but we should take care and always remain in the company of good people. Just as we cannot hug a wild tiger, we must take the same care by keeping away from evil-minded people. The Master always encouraged devotees to be in holy company. Even during these times of lockdown and social distancing, we can still remain in holy company by attending the online satsangs, Hinduism classes, and reading from our scriptures like the Ramayana, the Tirukkural, as well as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, all of which contain great spiritual treasures. The Dipika, which is a publication of the ashram, has many interesting stories and beautiful pictures to remind us of God and allow us to be in holy company. We conclude today's class with chapter 6, verse 30 of the Bhagavad Gita, where Sri Krishna says, "Om Yo Mam Pashyati Sarvatra Sarvam Chamai Pashyati Tasyaham Na Pranashyami Sacha Me Na Pranashyati." The meaning of this verse is, he who sees the Lord in all beings and all beings in the Lord never becomes separated from the Lord. The teachings and incidents discussed in today's class help us to understand the meaning of this verse in more detail. We learn that God alone exists in this world. Sri Ramakrishna saw God everywhere and reminds us of the divinity that is within each one of us. Remembering this important teaching of the Master and the divine words of Sri Krishna, we soon realize that we can never be separated from the Lord, who is in every being and in everything. May the all-compassionate Lord guide, bless, and protect us always. Hari Om Tat Sat. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.